Officer Daniels had worked in the police department for many years, and in that time he had built a reputation that everyone in the community seemed to know about. Some people described him as strict or tough, but those words were only a polite way of covering up the truth. The real truth was that Daniels was feared. His presence on the streets made people nervous, and his actions left behind anger, frustration, and in many cases, deep wounds that no one could see on the surface. People in the neighborhood knew that. If you were young, poor, or especially if you were black or from a minority community, an encounter with Officer Daniels was something you would never forget. Stories about his behavior were whispered in barbershops, family gatherings, and even schools. Parents would warn their children, "Stay away from him. If you see Officer Daniels, don't give him a reason to notice you." For many, it wasn't. About breaking the lid was about surviving the daily fear of being treated unfairly. Inside the police department, his fellow officers also knew his reputation. Some quietly disapproved of the way he treated people, but most stayed silent. They had seen others try to challenge him or report his behavior, only to end up isolated, mocked, or ignored by their superiors. Daniels had a way of intimidating, not just citizens, but also the people he worked with. His overconfidence came from years of getting away with things. Each time a complaint was filed against him, it somehow disappeared or was buried in paperwork. Every time a citizen spoke out, the department would find a way to protect him. Over time, this built a sense of invincibility in Daniels. He began to believe he was untouchable. He walked the streets with his chest puffed out, daring anyone to question his authority. When he pulled people over, his tone was often filled with arrogance. He treated every interaction as though he were above the law he was supposed to enforce. For some, it was not just his uniform that made him dangerous, it was his personal hatred and bias, which he no longer tried to hide. But reputation is a strange thing. While Daniels thought of himself as powerful, respected, and feared, the truth was that many people saw him as a bully with a badge. The community did not trust him. Some even avoided calling the police when they needed help, just because they feared he might show up. Parents would rather handle problems themselves than risk their children being mistreated by him. And while Daniels thought he had authority, what he really had was a growing list of enemies and a shadow that followed him everywhere. There were small moments, too, that revealed who he really was. A store owner once told a story about how Daniels treated him roughly for closing his shop late one night, even though the man had done nothing wrong. A mother remembered how Daniels shouted at her teenage son for no reason, pushing him against a wall while the boy cried and begged to go home. None of these stories ever made it into official reports. They lived only in the memories of the people who endured them. Yet, they spread across the community like wildfire. Daniels never realized how much people were watching him, how every action he took left a scar on someone's life. In his mind, he was still the authority, still the man in charge. He wore his uniform like a shield and believed it made him untouchable. But what he didn't understand was that reputations can be powerful weapons. A bad reputation may be ignored for a time, but it grows silently, like a storm gathering in the distance. And when the storm finally comes, it is unstoppable. The truth was that Daniels' reputation was already preparing the ground for his downfall. People had grown tired of his behavior. The community was waiting for someone strong enough to stand against him, someone who could put an end to the fear he had created. Inside the department, younger officers were beginning to notice too. They may not have spoken aloud, but in their hearts, they knew Daniels did not represent the kind of police officer they wanted to be. So while Officer Daniels carried on with his arrogance, believing no one could ever touch him, a quiet resistance was already forming. His reputation was not just a story about who he was, it was a warning. A record of injustice that could not be erased forever. Every rumor, every whisper, Every frightened parent telling their child to avoid him was another crack in the armor he thought was unbreakable. Daniels lived his life as though the world belonged to him. But in reality, he was walking on borrowed time. The people who feared him today would one day be the same people who stood together against him. And the woman who would deliver the most shocking blow of all was already rising through the ranks, preparing for the day when his reputation would finally catch up with him. Angela Carter's story began far from the spotlight of police headquarters. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood, raised by a mother who worked double shifts as a nurse and a father who never stopped reminding her that dignity and courage were worth more than money. From the very beginning, Angela knew what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers sometimes ignored her. Classmates teased her for dreaming too big, and neighbors often said she should know her place. But Angela was never the type to shrink in silence. She carried herself with quiet determination, as though she was already preparing for battles she hadn't yet faced. From a young age, Angela showed signs of leadership. When other kids fought in school, she was the one who stepped in to calm them down. When her younger siblings struggled with homework, she sat beside them, explaining every detail until they understood. Even when she was just a teenager, people noticed she had a presence and inner strength that made others listen. Yet, despite her talents, she was constantly reminded of the barriers in front of her. Being a black girl in a system built to push her aside meant she had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously. Her dream of working in law enforcement came after a painful experience in her community. One evening, she watched from her window as officers stormed into her neighbor's yard, accusing a young black boy of stealing from a store. Angela knew the boy personally. He was shy, gentle, and spent more time drawing in his notebook than getting into trouble, but none of that mattered. The officers shouted at him, pushed him to the ground, and handcuffed him while his mother screamed for mercy. Angela felt powerless that night, but she also felt something else, a fire that burned inside her. She promised herself she would never let injustice go unchallenged again. When Angela applied to the police academy years later, many doubted she would make it. Some instructors even questioned if she was strong enough or tough enough for the job. They never said it openly, but she could feel their doubts were tied to both her gender and her skin color. Still, Angela thrived. She trained harder than anyone else, stayed up later than the rest to study laws and procedures, and pushed her body past exhaustion to prove that she belonged. Her classmates soon noticed that she wasn't just trying to pass, she was aiming to be the best. Angela's early years on the force were filled with challenges. She was often assigned the cases no one wanted, patrolled the roughest neighborhoods, and dealt with disrespect from colleagues who thought she didn't deserve the badge. Some tried to break her spirit with cruel jokes or unnecessary criticism. But instead of bowing her head, she used their doubt as fuel. With every insult, she worked harder. With every attempt to push her aside, she carved out her own space. Slowly, she built a reputation not as someone to be pitied, but as someone to be respected. Her empathy also set her apart. While others rushed through cases, Angela listened to the people she served. Victims trusted her because she treated them like human beings instead of numbers on a report. Children admired her because she spoke to them kindly instead of barking orders. Even criminals once caught sometimes looked at her with a strange respect, recognizing that she did her job without cruelty. Her ability to balance strength with compassion became her greatest weapon, but with success came jealousy. There were whispers in the department, officers muttering that she was only promoted to fill diversity quotas. Others dismissed her achievements, saying she got lucky. Yet each time they doubted her, Angela answered with results. She solved cases that others overlooked, uncovered truths that others ignored, and earned the trust of both her colleagues and the community. Her work spoke louder than the voices trying to tear her down. One day, during a citywide investigation into police misconduct, Angela was given a chance to prove herself on a larger scale. She worked tirelessly, reviewing files that others had, ignored interviewing witnesses who had long been silenced, and piecing together patterns of abuse. What she discovered was shocking, a system that often protected the very officers accused of wrongdoing. Her meticulous work impressed her superiors, but more importantly, it gave victims hope that someone within the force actually cared. By the time Angela was considered for the position of head of internal affairs, many were stunned. She was still young compared to others in line for the role, and she was the first black woman even nominated. Whispers filled the hallways, some celebrated her potential appointment, while others grumbled in disbelief. But Angela's record was undeniable. Her investigations were thorough, her leadership was steady, and her reputation as an honest, fearless officer was spreading far beyond her department. When the announcement was made, the city buzzed with excitement. For the community, it was more than just a promotion, it was a moment of history. A black woman, once underestimated and dismissed, was now in charge of holding officers accountable. She represented change, hope, and a shift in power that many had thought impossible. For the first time, people believed that their voices might finally be heard inside the walls of the police department. Angela, however, did not celebrate too loudly. She knew the weight of her new position. Being the head of internal affairs meant she was now responsible for investigating her own colleagues, many of whom resented her presence. She understood that enemies would multiply and the spotlight would grow harsher. But none of this frightened her. She had walked through fire to get here, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Unbeknownst to her, the greatest test of her career was waiting just around the corner. The same officer whose reputation haunted the city for years. Officer Daniels was about to collide with her in the most shocking way. And when that moment came, everything she had endured, every insult, every struggle, every sleepless night would finally prove its purpose. The change in leadership sent ripples through the police department. Some officers celebrated Angela Carter's promotion, quietly relieved that someone honest and fearless was now leading internal affairs. But others, those who had grown comfortable with the old ways, felt threatened. For years, misconduct had been covered up, complaints had been brushed aside, and certain officers believed they were above the law. Now, with Angela in charge, the walls of protection that shielded them were beginning to crack. The community outside the station felt it too. For years, citizens had filed complaints that went nowhere. Parents, store owners, workers, and students had stories of being mistreated by officers, yet most of their voices never reached the surface. But whispers of hope began spreading. Maybe this time, someone would finally listen. People who once thought filing a complaint was a waste of energy were reconsidering. They said things like, maybe it's different now. Maybe she will actually hear us. The stack of old complaints was overwhelming. Angela spent late nights in her office, buried in files that were dusty from being ignored. Many were thin, just a single sheet of paper with a dismissed note at the bottom, unfounded. No evidence. Others were thicker, filled with testimonies that had been carefully overlooked. The more she read, the more a pattern emerged. Time and time again, the same names appeared: officers who were accused of harassment, brutality, and prejudice, yet never punished. One name stood out more than any other: Officer Daniels. His file was like a dark thread, woven through the history of the department. Pages of reports, some dating back more than a decade, told stories of intimidation, unnecessary force, and racial profiling. Black teenagers were stopped for fitting descriptions that never matched. Small business owners described harassment during routine checks. In one chilling complaint, a father wrote that Daniels pulled over his family on their way home from church, humiliating them in front of their children for no reason. The complaint ended with a line that broke Angela's heart. "How do I teach?" My children to respect the law when the law disrespects us. But just like all the others, that file had been marked. Case closed. No wrongdoing found. Angela knew what this meant. Daniels wasn't just an officer with a bad reputation. He was protected. Someone, or maybe several people, had been shielding him for years. Each time he crossed a line, the department closed ranks. Supervisors ignored evidence, colleagues refused to testify, and records conveniently disappeared. The whispers of corruption were not just rumors, they were real. And Daniel's case was the loudest whisper of them all. Inside the department, Angela noticed the silence that followed his name. When she asked questions about Daniels, officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided eye contact. Others pretended not to hear. A few even warned her in hushed tones, "Be careful. You don't want to get involved with him." But Angela was not the type to back down. She understood that silence was its own kind of corruption, and she refused to let fear guide her decisions. Outside, the community had long stopped expecting justice when it came to Daniels. His name carried weight, not because of respect, but because of dread. Parents used his name like a warning, telling their children to avoid trouble at all costs. Shopkeepers shook their heads whenever he walked by. For years, people had whispered their anger in private, but now, with Angela leading internal affairs, those whispers began to grow louder. One evening, Angela attended a community forum, sitting quietly in the back as citizens voiced their concerns about policing. One by one, people stood up and shared painful stories. A teenager talked about being stopped by Daniels on his way to school. A grandmother explained how her grandson had been arrested without cause and later released with no apology. A young mother, her voice shaking, described being pulled over late at night, terrified as Daniels leaned into her window with a smirk that told her she had no power. Angela listened to every word, her pen moving quickly across her notebook. She didn't speak, but the people noticed her presence. They could feel that this time, someone wasn't just hearing them, someone was truly listening. By the end of the night, a quiet hope filled the room. For the first time in years, people felt like the truth might matter again. Back at the department, the whispers of corruption turned into resistance. Some officers grew uneasy as Angela pulled out old cases. Files that had long been hidden were now being re-examined. Questions that had never been asked were being raised. Daniels himself noticed the shift. He could sense the eyes on him, the change in tone when people spoke. Though still arrogant, he began to wonder how much Angela really knew. Angela, meanwhile, was not just gathering facts, she was building a case. She knew that if she went after Daniels, it had to be done carefully and thoroughly. One mistake, and the same system that protected him for years would crush her efforts. But she also knew something else. Corruption, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves behind cracks. And those cracks were beginning to show. Late one night, as Angela sat alone in her office, she looked at the growing pile of evidence. The whispers of corruption were no longer whispers. They were voices, loud and undeniable, carried in the stories of people who had been silenced for too long. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for justice against one man. She was standing against an entire system that had allowed men like Daniels to thrive. And though she was prepared for the battles ahead, she knew one thing with certainty. The walls that had protected Officer Daniels for so long were about to come crashing down. Asterisk. The day of Angela Carter's appointment was unlike any other the department had seen. The announcement was scheduled for the morning, and by the time the press gathered outside the police headquarters, the air was heavy with both excitement and tension. For years, leadership positions had been filled by the same familiar faces, older men, often from the same backgrounds, carrying the same views. Many people had quietly accepted that things would never change. But that morning, whispers moved through the city like a current. They're giving internal affairs to her. Inside the building, officers stood around in groups, some shaking their heads, others whispering with disbelief. To them, Angela's promotion was unthinkable. She wasn't just a woman in a male-dominated field. She was a black woman. And she was about to take the most feared role in the department, head of internal affairs. It was a position that demanded courage because internal affairs was not there to protect officers, it was there to investigate them. And for the first time in history, the person leading that office would be someone many had dismissed, underestimated, or openly disrespected. Angela sat quietly in her office, waiting for the official call to step forward. She thought about her parents, about the nights she had stayed awake studying law, about the voices of victims whose complaints had been ignored. She remembered the community meetings, the trembling voices of mothers and fathers, the frustration of young men who felt hunted rather than protected. All of that weighed on her shoulders, but instead of fear, it gave her strength. She knew this appointment wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had been silenced. When her name was announced, the cameras flashed, and the reporters rushed to capture the moment. Angela walked to the podium, her posture straight, her face calm but firm. She didn't smile because she knew this wasn't a celebration, it was a responsibility. The crowd noticed her presence immediately. There was something powerful in the way she carried herself, something that spoke louder than any speech. She began by thanking those who had supported her journey. But she wasted no time in addressing the truth. Internal affairs is not here to cover mistakes. It is here to hold us accountable, she said, her voice steady. We cannot demand respect from the community if we do not respect them first. We cannot expect trust if we are not honest. That changes now. The room was silent. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the shield they had long depended on might no longer exist. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word, while members of the community watching on television whispered to themselves, "She's serious. She really means it." For Angela, the appointment was more than a new title, it was a declaration of war against corruption. She understood that her very presence in that role was already a shock to many. Some officers whispered behind her back, questioning her authority. A few muttered openly, "She won't last long." But Angela didn't need their approval. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to be effective. Her first days in office revealed the depth of resistance she would face. Files she requested were delayed. Some officers refused to cooperate with her investigations. Even small things, like meetings or resources, were quietly sabotaged to slow her progress. But Angela had grown up fighting battles harder than this. She had survived discrimination, ridicule, and doubt. A few petty tactics weren't going to shake her. Instead, she doubled down. She worked late nights, reviewing old cases. She met with community members personally, listening to their stories without the barrier of paperwork. She opened a hotline that allowed citizens to directly report misconduct to her office, cutting through the red tape that had protected bad officers for years. Slowly, she began to chip away at the wall of silence. The community noticed. For the first time in decades, people believed their complaints might actually matter. Victims who had been ignored for years began to step forward again, sharing their stories with a new sense of courage. Angela's appointment wasn't just symbolic, it was changing the relationship between the department and the people it served. But with every step forward, the enemies grew louder. Some officers mocked her behind closed doors. Others tried to intimidate her with cold stares in the hallway. Daniels, in particular, was furious. For years, he had walked freely, knowing internal affairs would never touch him. But now, with Angela in charge, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. He laughed it off in front of others, but deep down, he sensed danger. Angela, however, remained focused. She knew she was walking into a storm, but she was prepared for it. Each day, she reminded herself why she was there, not for approval, not for power, but for justice. Her role was not about making the department comfortable. It was about making it honest. One evening, as she walked out of headquarters, a young boy approached her with his mother. The boy looked nervous, clutching his backpack tightly. His mother explained that he had been stopped unfairly by officers the week before, and she wanted to thank Angela for listening to stories like theirs. Angela knelt down to the boy's level, looked him in the eyes, and said softly, "No one has the right to make you feel less than you are. Don't ever forget that." That moment captured exactly what her appointment meant. To the corrupt officers, it was a threat. To the silent victims, it was hope. And to the city as a whole, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice had a voice. And that voice belonged to a woman who refused to bow. Angela Carter's historic appointment didn't just change her life. It shook an entire department, challenged a culture of silence, and set the stage for the battle that was about to come. Because sooner than anyone expected, her mission to hold officers accountable would bring her face to face with the man who symbolized everything she was fighting against, Officer Daniels. The storm had been brewing for weeks. Angela Carter had spent late nights in her office, combing through files, piecing together testimonies, and connecting dots that others had ignored for years. The deeper she went, the clearer it became. Officer Daniels was at the center of it all. His name was tied to countless complaints, his actions leaving scars across the community. To many, he was just a rumor, a shadow of corruption. But to Angela, he was now a case that demanded answers. She didn't rush. Angela knew Daniels was powerful in his own way. He had friends in high places, allies who had shielded him for years. One mistake, one sloppy move, and her investigation could be buried like all the others before it. So she built her case with care, brick by brick. Witnesses who once refused to speak were now willing to talk, knowing she was different. Records that had been hidden in dusty drawers resurfaced. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of the invincibility Daniels believed he had. Daniels, meanwhile, was growing uneasy. At first, he laughed off the rumors. He mocked the idea of Angela leading internal affairs, sneering to his colleagues, "What's she gonna do? Lecture me?" But the laughter didn't last. He began noticing changes, old cases being reopened. Colleagues whispering when he entered the room, strange looks in the hallways. And then came the summons, an official notice to report to Internal Affairs for questioning. The moment he read the letter, Daniels felt a chill. No one had dared summon him before. For years, he had been untouchable, above scrutiny. But now, someone had called him in. He crumpled the paper in his hand, furious, but beneath his anger was something new: fear. The day of the confrontation arrived. Daniels walked into the Internal Affairs office with his usual swagger, his badge shining on his chest, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. He expected to see some nervous junior officer waiting to question him, someone he could intimidate with a glare or a sharp word. But when the door opened and he stepped into the room, he froze. Sitting at the head of the table was Angela Carter. Calm, composed, and steady, she looked up from the file in front of her. For a moment, their eyes locked, and the silence was heavier than any words. Daniel's arrogance cracked ever so slightly. He hadn't expected her. He hadn't imagined that the woman whose presence had been whispered through the department would be the one sitting across from him. With the power to strip away his shield of protection, Angela didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Officer Daniels," she said firmly, "please take a seat." The room was simple, no distractions, no crowd, just the two of them and the truth sitting between them. Daniel sat down slowly, trying to regain his composure. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, forcing a smirk onto his face. "So this is how it is now. You think you can drag me in here like some rookie?" Angela opened the file and began reading aloud the complaints, one after another. Each story painted the same picture: intimidation, racial profiling, abuse of power. She didn't add emotion to her words. She didn't need to. The weight of the evidence spoke for itself. As the list grew longer, Daniel shifted in his chair. His smirk faltered. He tried to interrupt, to dismiss the accusations as lies, but Angela held up her hand. "You've been given the benefit of silence for years," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "That silence ends today." Daniel's temper flared. "You don't know what it's like out there. These people lie. They make up stories because they hate the uniform. I'm the one keeping the streets clean while you sit in here reading papers." Angela leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. "The uniform doesn't give you the right to destroy lives. It doesn't give you the right to target people because of the color of their skin. Law enforcement isn't about fear, Officer Daniels. It's about justice. And justice is exactly what we're here for." For the first time in years, Daniels felt cornered. He had always believed he could out-talk, out-shout, or out-muscle anyone who questioned him. But Angela wasn't intimidated. Her presence filled the room, and her calmness was more powerful than any anger. She didn't need to prove herself to him. She had already proven it to everyone who mattered. The confrontation stretched on for hours. Angela presented evidence, one piece at a time, dismantling the wall of excuses Daniels tried to build. His voice grew louder, his arguments weaker. The more he fought, the clearer it became. He was running out of room to hide. Outside the office, a few officers lingered in the hallway, pretending to go about their work, but secretly listening. They couldn't hear every word, but they could sense the shift. For years, Daniels had walked those halls untouchable. He was just another officer under investigation, and the person questioning him was the woman he once mocked. Inside, Angela never raised her voice, never lost control. She didn't need to. She knew this confrontation wasn't just about Officer Daniels. It was about sending a message to the entire department. Corruption could no longer hide behind fear. When the session finally ended, Daniels walked out of the office, his face pale, his swagger gone. The officers in the hallway watched silently as he passed. For the first time, he looked smaller, weaker. Like the weight of his own actions was finally pressing down on him. Angela remained at the table, her hand resting on the thick file of evidence. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled, knowing this was only the beginning. The confrontation had happened, but the real battle, the one that would decide whether justice would prevail, was still ahead. The interrogation room was empty again, but the air still held the echoes of the confrontation between Angela Carter and Officer Daniels. For days afterward, Daniels tried to convince himself that nothing had changed. He walked through the precinct with his chest out, forcing his old swagger, pretending the meeting had been nothing more than routine. But deep down, he knew better. Something about Angela's calm voice, her steady eyes, and the mountain of evidence she laid before him haunted him in a way he couldn't shake. For the first time in his career, Daniels felt exposed. He'd always been the one holding power, the one who controlled the fear in others. But now, that power seemed fragile, as if it could shatter with one wrong move. Every time he caught Angela's eye in the hallway, he felt a chill, as though she was seeing straight through him, past his uniform, past his arrogance, straight to the corruption he had hidden for years. Angela, meanwhile, continued her work with quiet determination. She knew Daniels was rattled, but she also knew he was dangerous. Men like him didn't crumble easily. They fought back, clinging to the lies that had protected them for so long. That's why she needed more than just words. She needed a moment so powerful it would strip away his defenses completely. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. One late afternoon, Angela called Daniels back into the interrogation room. This time, the atmosphere was different. The blinds were half closed, the lights dimmer, the silence heavier. Daniels stepped inside, trying to mask his nerves with a smirk. Back for round 2. He muttered, dropping into the chair across from her. Angela didn't respond right away. Instead, she slid a thick folder across the table. Daniels stared at it, confused. He had expected more of the same mold complaints, familiar accusations. The kind of evidence he had always dismissed as exaggerated. But when he opened the folder, his face drained of color. Inside were photographs, recordings, and sworn testimonies. Witnesses he thought had disappeared were now speaking out. Cases he believed were buried had been reopened. One photo showed him during a traffic stop, towering over a frightened teenager whose eyes were filled with tears. Another contained a recording, shaky but clear, of his voice yelling insults during an arrest. Page after page, the evidence piled up, undeniable and damning. Daniels slammed the folder shut, his hands trembling. "This doesn't prove anything," he barked, his voice louder than before. But his tone betrayed him. Angela leaned forward, her gaze unflinching. "It proves enough," she said firmly. "The department can no longer protect you. These are not whispers anymore, Officer Daniels. These are voices, loud, clear, and demanding justice. And this time, they will be heard." For a moment, Daniels sat frozen. The man who had once believed he was untouchable now looked small, cornered, and uncertain. His mind raced. He thought of the colleagues who once had his back, the supervisors who always brushed aside complaints. But now, none of them could save him. Angela had built a case so strong that even his allies would think twice before defending him. The shocking moment wasn't just the evidence, it was the realization that the system he had relied on for protection was crumbling. He could feel it in the way other officers looked at him differently now, in the way the silence in the precinct followed him like a shadow. The invincible shield he wore for years was gone. Angela didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or celebrate his fear. She simply closed the folder and looked him in the eye. "You've hurt people who trusted this badge," she said quietly. "You've broken the very oath you swore to uphold, and now you will be held accountable. Not because I say so, because the truth cannot be hidden anymore." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, trying to summon the arrogance that had always carried him. But no words came. For the first time in his life, silence wrapped around him like chains. He had spent years silencing others, but now he was the one with no voice. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Angela had done what no one before her could. She had stripped away his illusions of power. And though Daniels didn't admit it aloud, he knew the truth. The woman sitting across from him was not just another officer. She was the one who had shattered the empire of lies he had built. When the session ended, Daniels walked out of the room slowly, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. Officers in the hallway glanced at him, and for the first time, their eyes did not carry respect or fear, they carried pity. The mighty had fallen, and everyone could see it. Angela remained seated in the quiet room, the closed folder resting. In front of her, she knew this was only one step in a longer journey, but she also knew this moment mattered. Daniels had been exposed, not just to her, but to himself. The man who once thought he was untouchable had finally realized the truth. No one is above accountability, and in that shocking silence, a shift had begun, not just for Daniels, but for the entire department. The precinct felt different in the days after Angela's confrontation with Officer Daniels. The man who had once walked the halls with his head high, his boots pounding with arrogance, now moved quietly, his steps slower, his eyes darting as if he expected whispers to follow him, and they did. Officers who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his gaze. The shield of protection that had covered him for years was cracking, and everyone could see it. Angela, however, did not let the silence lull her into satisfaction. She knew Daniels was still dangerous not because of what he could do, but because of what he represented. He was more than just one corrupt officer. He was a symbol of how deep the rot had grown inside the system. If she failed to hold him accountable, the message would be clear. Nothing had changed. But if she succeeded, the city would finally see that the walls of corruption could be torn down. She began by finalizing the case. Every complaint, every testimony, every piece of evidence was organized into a file so strong it could not be ignored. Angela double-checked every word, knowing Daniels would try to twist the truth. She reached out to witnesses personally, assuring them their voices would be heard this time. For some, it was the first time anyone from the department had ever shown them respect. For others, it was a painful reopening of wounds, but they trusted Angela because she had already proven herself different. The hearing was scheduled in front of the review board. The day arrived with a tension that hung in the air like a storm. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing while the community watched closely. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about the entire department being forced to face its reflection. Inside the room, rows of chairs were filled with officers, city officials, and members of the public who had been waiting years for this very moment. Daniels entered wearing his uniform, but it no longer carried the same weight. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He tried to sit tall, but the confidence was gone. He was a man stripped of his armor, forced into the spotlight he had always avoided. Angela walked in calmly, carrying the thick file of evidence. She didn't look at Daniels right away. She didn't need to. Her focus was on the truth, not the man who had tried to bury it. When the board called her forward, she placed a file on the table, opened it, and began to speak. Her words were not loud, but they carried weight. She told the stories of those who had been silenced, ordinary people who had been humiliated, threatened, and abused. She spoke of the teenager stopped on his way to school, of the family pulled over after church, of the grandmother who had begged for fairness. One by one, the faces of the community came alive in her voice. The room was silent as she spoke, every word carving away at the image Daniels had tried to protect. Daniels tried to defend himself. He raised his voice, calling the complaints lies, blaming angry citizens for targeting him. But each time he spoke, Angela countered with evidence, recordings, photographs, testimonies that could not be denied. Every argument he made collapsed under the weight of proof. The louder he grew, the smaller he appeared. At one point, recording was played aloud in the room, his own voice, shouting racial slurs during an arrest. The sound echoed through the chamber, and the silence that followed was deafening. Daniels' face burned red. For years, his words had cut deep into others. Now they cut into him, leaving nowhere to hide. The board members exchanged looks. Some had known about the whispers of Daniels' behavior, but seeing the truth laid bare in such undeniable detail was different. The community members in the audience sat forward, holding their breath, their eyes shining with both pain and hope. Angela did not raise her voice, did not waver. She ended her presentation with simple words. No badge, no position, no power should ever place someone above the law. If we protect corruption, we destroy the very trust that holds this department together. It ends here. When the decision came, it felt like the air itself shifted. The board voted unanimously. Daniels was guilty of misconduct. His badge and weapon were taken. His career in law enforcement was over. For the first time in his life, Daniels was powerless. As he stood, stripped of the authority he once abused. The room seemed to close in around him. The officers who once feared him now looked at him with disdain. The citizens who once trembled in his presence now watched him fall. Angela, calm and steady, stood as the embodiment of the justice he thought he could outrun. Outside, the news spread quickly. People gathered in the streets, some cheering, some crying, all recognizing the weight of what had just happened. For years, they had lived under the shadow of corruption, believing nothing would ever change. But Angela had proven them wrong. She had shown that courage could break silence, that truth could topple power, and that accountability was possible. Even for the untouchable, in that moment, Angela wasn't just the head of internal affairs. She was a symbol of change. Her fight wasn't over. There were still many battles ahead. But with Daniel's fall, she had delivered a message that could not be ignored. The system could no longer hide its sins. And for the first time in years, the city breathed a little easier, believing that justice had finally taken its rightful leave. I'll see that its rightful place. The fall of Officer Daniels was more than the end of a corrupt man's career. 'Twas the beginning of something larger. The city, once weighed down by fear and mistrust, began to stir with a new kind of energy. For the first time in years, people walked into community meetings with hope instead of resignation. Parents spoke openly about their concerns without fear of being ignored. Young men who once whispered their anger in alleys now raised their voices in public, believing someone would listen. Angela Carter had not set out to become a hero. She had only wanted to do her job, to hold the department accountable, to bring justice where it had long been absent. But the way she carried herself, the way she stood unshaken against the storm, turned her into something much greater. She became a symbol not just for the people of the city, but for anyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. In the weeks following Daniel's dismissal, Angela continued her work with the same quiet determination. She did not allow herself to bask in the victory. She knew corruption was not erased in a single trial, nor could trust be rebuilt overnight. There were still files stacked high on her desk, still voices waiting to be heard. But now, the difference was clear. Those voices had found a champion. Children pointed to her picture in the newspaper and said, "That's her. That's the woman who made the bad officer leave." Elderly men and women who had once turned their heads in disappointment. When they saw a patrol car now stopped Angela in the street to thank her. A grandmother pressed her hands together, tears in her eyes, as she told Angela, "You've given us back our dignity." Inside the department, change came slowly, but it came nonetheless. Some officers grumbled, angry at the new standards, but others, especially the younger recruits, saw in Angela the kind of officer they wanted to be. She had proven that strength wasn't about intimidation, but about integrity. She had shown that justice didn't need to roar to be powerful, it only needed to be relentless. Daniel's absence was felt, but not in the way he had imagined. Where once he had inspired fear, now his downfall inspired caution. Officers began to think twice before bending the rules. Supervisors who had once ignored misconduct now hesitated, knowing Angela's eyes were on them. The silence that had protected corruption was breaking piece by piece. Angela herself remained humble. When asked by reporters if she considered herself a hero, she always shook her head. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about the people who trusted the system and the people who lost faith in it. My job is to make sure their voices matter. That's all." But her modesty did little to stop the community from lifting her up as a symbol. Schools invited her to speak, not just about law enforcement, but about perseverance, about fighting for what's right even when the world doubts you. She told students about her struggles, about the times she was told she would never make it, about the long nights she wanted to give up but didn't. Her words lit fires in young hearts. especially in those who had been told to keep their dreams small. The city itself began to change too. Citizens who had once been divided found unity in their shared desire for fairness. Community programs grew stronger. Partnerships between residents and police became more genuine. Trust, fragile but present, began to rebuild. And through it all, Angela kept working. She still faced resistance, still encountered officers who glared at her with resentment, still heard the quiet grumbles of those who longed for the old ways. But she no longer fought alone. The community stood behind her, their whispers now transformed into shouts of support. One evening, long after the sun had set, Angela stood at the window of her office, looking out at the city lights. She thought of her childhood, of the boy in her neighborhood who had been dragged away unfairly, of the promises she had made to herself on nights when injustice felt too heavy. She thought of her parents' sacrifices, of the teachers who had doubted her, of the officers who had mocked her. And she thought of Daniels, the man who had believed himself untouchable. Now nothing more than a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets truth. Angela smiled softly, not with pride, but with purpose. She knew her work was far from over. The system was large and change was slow. But she also knew this: symbols have power. And whether she wanted it or not, she had become one dot to the community. She was proof that justice could rise from within the very walls that once silenced it. To the department, she was a reminder that no one, not even the most feared officer, was above accountability. And to the next generation, she was living proof that dreams, no matter how unlikely, could change the world. Angela Carter was more than the head of internal affairs. She was a symbol of change, a light in the dark, and a voice that refused to be silenced. And though her story was still being written, one truth was already clear. She had turned whispers of fear into echoes of hope.